Almost everybody knows about the Dudley Street story, and we'll talk more about both of those stories because we've learned so much from them. But I think it's also important to note that there are hundreds and hundreds of smaller stories, not the big ones, not the $10 million ones, but the little block by block, church by church, household by household, business by business, public housing building by public housing building, where residents have said, you know, nobody is going to be rebuilding this neighborhood unless we do it. And so they've invested themselves fully in that task. And those are the stories we've tried to learn from. We've tried to gather those stories up and then open up a discussion with community folks, just like you all, across the United States, about then what are the major kinds of lessons that are to be learned from these stories. If you look at success, we ought to learn from it. We ought to be able to multiply these successes. That's what we've been trying to do. We've learned a lot. There are a lot of lessons in these stories. But I think probably if we had to think about the way in which one lesson continues to sort of float to the top of our consciousness, it would be a lesson about how communities at their center get built on the gifts of the people who live there. John, why don't you tell us about this major lesson that I think has become clear to us?
Right. Well, you know, if you'd had the good luck we had to go to city after city and look for where people are solving problems, where they're making the economy grow again, where they're gaining political power, where they're solving social problems, where they're creating new celebrations and recognition of culture, you would see, I think, what we saw, and that is that every single one of these initiatives had one common characteristic, and it's this. It's probably best exemplified by this picture here. It's a picture of a glass, and you know how, as a kid, people would ask you, is this glass half full or is it half empty? And the answer to that, we all know, is yes, it is. It's half full and it's half empty. And it is like us as individuals, right? We are people who have some deficiencies and emptiness, but we have some gifts and capacities. And it's also like neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are places that have capacities, and neighborhoods are places that have deficiencies, or some people would call them needs. But what you would see if you visited neighborhoods across this country is that the way communities get built, solve problems, and grow more powerful is by focusing on the capacities and not the needs. And yet we don't think about that very much because so many people speak to us in the language of needs. But if we think about it in our own lives, we will know that communities are built on capacities. Let me give you an example. I have a little hometown, small place in Wisconsin, 1,300 people, and there's a group there called the Knights of Columbus. And they decided to build a community center and a meeting hall for them, but they're going to give it to the town for a town hall and community center. And I was home, and I knew the 4 knights who were building it. And let me describe to you what I saw, because you've seen exactly the same thing. Up on the roof was a guy whose name is John, and he was putting in on the shingles, right, of this 2-story frame house. And John's a drunk. Everybody in town knows it. And incidentally, in the big city nearby, they think he's chemically dependent. But in our town, he's a drunk. We have room in our town for a drunk. The room is on the roof putting the shingles on our community center. And on the 2nd floor was a guy named Jim. And Jim was putting in an electric switch. But Jim left school at the end of the 8th grade. He said the teachers were too dumb to teach him. Now, I think people in university might say he's learning disabled. In my hometown, people just say he's slow. And he's our electrician. I could see him putting in the switch. And also on the 2nd floor, there's a guy named Steve, and Steve is a plumber, right? And I also know that Steve has dark days. He becomes depressed. He stays home. Probably trouble at home with his wife and his children when that happens. And on the first floor was a guy named John who was putting in an oak flooring like a carpenter. And he has one leg. And that's who built our community center. That's who built every place you have ever been or ever will be. Communities are built on the basis of the gifts and the capacities of people who also have deficiencies, but communities have never been built by a focus on their needs and deficiencies. Just think about any group you belong to. Think about a group at work, or think about in your community or in your religious organization. You could go around the members of that group and identify every one of them as being a person with a problem and deficiency, right? I can do that with my faculty. We have on my faculty, which I think is a very good faculty, a wonderful group, but we have a man who has cancer. We have a woman whose family has just fallen apart. We have a colleague, I think he's mad, but we're a good group. Because, like your groups, what we do is we have a quiet agreement that we're not going to focus on our cancer or our fallen apart families. But what we are is a group organized to lift up the gifts and the capacities of people who also have deficiencies. Now, I'll bet you that you've had that experience. Other people here, friends here in the studio, have you seen examples of the gifts of people who are also perhaps thought to have deficiencies as key actors? What about you?
I'm glad you asked that because I'm a former welfare recipient and also a mother of two. And I used to live in southeastern Virginia, and I've had to deal with stereotypes and all of that that's associated with welfare dependency or dealing with welfare. But I've always had the incentive to work. So other welfare recipients and I put together a small business, a small janitorial business, and we were able to empower ourselves out of welfare dependency and into self-sufficiency.
So somebody defined you by your emptiness of money, and you redefined yourself. You found in yourself your capacity, right? Anybody else here have any? Yes.
AmeriCorps gives out about 350 grants to communities around the country, and we have found that one of the most valuable resources in the community are the youth, that it's the youth that are mentoring and cleaning up the lots and doing conflict resolution, and that's one resource people don't usually tap into.
Yeah. Well, I think you've seen what we've seen, and I know what everybody around the country who's listening has seen, is that communities are built by a focus and a mobilization of the gifts and the capacities of their local people. But we also saw something else, and that is that in every community there is another voice at work. And what you hear about communities is not what we're talking about here, about gifts and capacities. What you hear about is deficiencies, problems, and needs. Jode, why don't you tell us a little more about how that plays out?
Yeah, John, you've been really sort of concentrating, we've been thinking about for a moment here, that both the reality of us as individual human beings, that we all have some gifts and we all have some emptiness about us and some problems about it. What's true of each of us as persons, I think, is also true of whole communities, right? And what we've begun to discover, and I think I discovered it first from a person who has become a close friend and a real mentor to me, a 75-year-old woman who's a resident for her entire life of the South Bronx in New York City, and a woman who's done incredible work in that community. And I was sitting on her front stoop with Mrs. Johnson about 5 summers ago now, and asking her to tell me her stories, both success stories, and then I said, also, tell me what went wrong here. Tell me what, when you think about what happened in this community of the South Bronx, what do you think about? She thought for a moment, and then she said, Jody, I think that the worst thing that has happened to us here in the South Bronx is that we've been put into a prison. That was the word she used, and I hadn't heard it before. So I asked her to elaborate, tell me a little bit more about what she was thinking about. She said, I'm not talking here about a prison that's made up of high walls and barbed wire and machine guns, right? We know about that kind of prison. But she said, and here's the phrase I'll never forget. She said, the prison I'm talking about is a prison that's made up of other people's ideas about who we are. here in the South Bronx. She said, which I now think is a brilliant formulation, she said then, I can't even go anyplace else in New York or in the suburbs and talk about my community, because the minute I say the word South Bronx, all of a sudden a whole flood of images comes into people's heads. All kinds of ideas. They think they know what I'm talking about when I say South Bronx, right? And she said what comes into their heads is all of a piece. It's all consistent. It's all about problems and needs and deficiencies. It's all about the emptiness, right? So John and I and some folks from communities began thinking about then, well, how would you begin to visualize this, right? And so this neighborhood needs map that we're now going to be showing is one way of thinking about what a community looks like when it's thought about only in terms of its emptiness, right? This is a needs map. This is a map that says, you know, the South Bronx is crime and child abuse and mental disabilities and welfare recipients and graffiti and slum housing and broken families and on and on and on, right? And what we heard was the strong voices of Mrs. Johnson and thousands like her that said, you know, this map is a prison. This has become a prison for us. And our problem with this map, it's like the glass, is not that this is an untrue map. This is a true map. All of these things exist not only in the South Bronx, but in the neighborhood I live in Chicago, and in all of the neighborhoods we work in. All of these problems exist, right? But the problem is that it's not the whole truth about those communities, and it's taken as if it is the whole truth. And whole sets of institutions and policies and powerful interests then pile on this needs map. Now, one of the things that's become so clear to us as we've gone from the community to community is that this needs map, which is so powerful, is not Mrs. Johnson's idea about who she is. It's not the idea of the folks in the block, in the churches, in the community building processes. They don't think about themselves as empty, deficient, needy, problematic. No, they have a different idea. But we know that this needs map is powerful, right? And so we began asking, well, if the folks in communities didn't draw this needs map about themselves, who did? Where does this needs map come from? It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Who drew it? So we began a little list of nominees for Cartographer of the Year, for people who draw needs maps. And John, I wonder whether you might nominate a few of our cartography people.
Yes. And it is strange because everybody knows communities are not built on needs. But there are, we think, at least 5 great institutions that have focused on neighborhoods as though that's all there, that is, but needs. And the first of those institutions is the one we're from, universities. Every university has people who are in the business of going into neighborhoods and looking at the deficiencies, counting them up. How many buildings that are below code? How many people are there who can't read? How many teenage pregnant girls are there? So universities have a big vested interest in counting up the deficiencies, and that's called needs surveys, right? Now, they do this work usually for some other institutions. The first of the other institutions that is interested in needs is a lot of foundations. A lot of foundations really give grants based on somebody coming in and telling them what's wrong with their neighborhood, what's bad about it, right? If you tell me what's bad, I'll give you some money. Now, not all foundations, but many, many are doing that. Another user of the university's needs surveys is the United Ways. They, in like manner, are often saying to communities, what we want to know is what's wrong. Now remember, nobody in the neighborhood needs to know that, right? They need to know what can we do about people's capacities. But somebody out there, in this case the United Way, wants to know what the people in the neighborhood don't need to know. So the United Way is another user of needs, but the United Way is changing. We know, Jody and I have had the wonderful opportunity to meet for 3 days with groups of United Way leaders, 120 of them across the country, and they're beginning to shift in terms of their emphasis. The third institution that we all know focusing on needs is governments.